NASA spent 4 years simulating gravitational paths between planets. He spent 4 minutes and only used a dry branch. This story doesn't begin in Houston, nor on a floating space station drifting through the endless dark. It begins in a small town with no traffic lights, where dirt roads outnumber paved ones, and where the seasons are split between when grass grows and when it simply doesn't. The boy's name was Evan. He lived with his mother in a quiet wooden house at the edge of a pine forest. The roof was streaked with moss, and the front porch tilted gently toward the sunrise, as if it, too, longed to be touched by the first light of day. Evan was 16, but the way he looked at the sky, or paused to listen when the wind passed through trees, or knelt to pick up a snapped branch on the ground, made it hard to call him a child. He didn't talk much, didn't care for crowds. At school, teachers often had to call his name more than once just to draw his eyes away from the desk, or from some invisible place where his mind had already gone. But there was one thing no one could deny. Evan drew. He drew like it was the only way he knew how to breathe. Not portraits, not buildings, not animals or landscapes. He only drew trees. But not any trees people recognized. They didn't grow up. They branched out, split, curled, and curved at strange angles. A main branch would divide into 2, then 3, then 5. But they never tangled. They had order, an unnamed order. That afternoon, Evan sat in the backyard, holding a twig in one hand, tracing lines into the dry soil. Each line, each branch he etched into the dirt, felt deliberate, as if there was already a map beneath the earth, and he was just revealing what had always been there. His mother, Louise, stood by the kitchen window watching him. She had grown used to afternoons like this, afternoons when her son didn't play soccer like the other boys, but sat quietly, drawing on the ground, on scraps of paper, on the backs of cereal boxes. She had once been afraid. Then she got used to it, and now only silence wrapped around them like an old friend. One time she asked him, "What are you drawing, Evan?" He didn't look up, just murmured, "The path of force." Schools don't like quiet children. Evan wasn't bullied. He was too quiet for that. But his silence unsettled his teachers. No clear answers, no confident gaze, no essays about wanting to be a doctor or an astronaut. The career counselor once told Louise after a parent meeting, "He's dreamy, not very practical. Perhaps he should consider a trade." Louise nodded politely. But that night, when she gathered the drawings her son had left scattered on the table, something trembled inside her. On one page, Evan had drawn a massive tree, each branch labeled with tiny, neat numbers. At the bottom, he had written, "If light can bend, why must we insist on straight lines?" That spring, the high school hosted a science fair. Evan was required to participate. He didn't bring a robot, no PowerPoint presentation like the other kids. He brought a large wooden board on which he had woven a branching structure using copper wire and white thread. It had no label, no captions, nothing but lines branching, turning, shrinking. The principal said, "Looks like a spider web." Some parents chuckled. Abstract art for a math class? Only one man stood silent. An older gentleman with silver hair, a gray coat, wire-frame glasses, and a notebook tucked into his chest pocket. He stepped closer to Evan's project, studying it for a long time without saying a word. Then he whispered, "A transition curve between acceleration nodes and a return path orbit?" Evan looked up, for the first time that morning. The man looked straight at him and asked, "Who taught you to draw like this?" Evan answered simply, "No one." I just draw what might happen after a force touches something. The man's eyes lit up, as if he'd just found something he'd been searching for his entire life. He extended a hand. Caldwell, professor of gravitational mechanics and trajectory design at NASA, retired. Then he turned to the silent room and said something that made the entire fair fall still. What this boy just drew is a soft routing gravitational model we haven't been able to stabilize in 4 years. That night, Louise couldn't sleep. Evan didn't talk much about the encounter, just said, "He wants to see more drawings." She watched her son as he slept, his hand still loosely wrapped around a pencil. On the table was another sketch, unfinished, a tree whose branch split, but not symmetrically. The line curved downward, spiraled gently, like a satellite slipping into a new orbit. She didn't know what it meant, only that it was beautiful, like wind falling softly on an old wooden roof. The boy didn't explain, didn't speak much. He just kept drawing, and the world began to bend. The art teacher asked, "What kind of tree is this?" He replied, "It's the path of force." Her name was Miriam Cole. She taught art part-time at the high school, hair tied up, wool sweater, and a voice that always seemed to be inviting something more beautiful to come closer. She wasn't the kind to judge quickly. At first, she thought Evan was just another quiet, slightly odd student. But when he turned in his first assignment, a large sheet of paper filled with branching, layered spirals, she paused longer than usual. Not because of the technique, but because of the structure. There was something honest about it. She asked him, "What kind of tree are you drawing?" Evan didn't look up. He simply replied, "It's not a tree." "Then what is it?" "It's force. Force, when it doesn't move straight." She didn't press further, just set the drawing aside and quietly took a photo with her phone. That night she searched for hours, trying to find a word that described those lines. Fractal? No. Branching system? Close, but not quite. Something was missing. Rhythm. Evan kept drawing. On paper, on the old wooden wall behind the house, even on flat stones by the stream. He never sketched beforehand, never measured. Each line simply emerged, then split, then turned toward a direction that seemed random, yet never collided with the others. Others saw chaos. He saw calm. On windy afternoons, as dry leaves danced across the yard, Evan imagined them drifting along invisible gravitational currents, each leaf a body, drawn by a pull, sliding along the same nameless curves he had been sketching for years, silently, without recognition. He didn't need the world to understand. But the world had begun to notice. The following week, Professor Caldwell returned. He brought nothing but a leather-bound notebook and a pair of eyes lit up like a man rediscovering youth. He didn't go to the school. He asked to meet Evan in the backyard, the place where Evan did most of his drawing. Louise made tea and set out 2 old wooden chairs under the shade of the pines. Caldwell didn't start with equations. He started with silence. He watched as Evan drew a new branch into the damp earth. This time, Evan used a longer stick. The main trunk split, then curved, responding to something unseen. "Why doesn't this branch go straight?" Caldwell asked. Evan paused, then said, "Because straight isn't true. Nothing moves straight if it's still alive." The professor nodded. "How do you think force travels?" he asked. Evan picked up a small stone and dropped it gently onto the sand. It didn't fall in a straight line. It rolled down a slight slope, shifted a little, and finally settled into a natural hollow. "It chooses the path that hurts least," Evan said. Caldwell opened his notebook and sketched a few diagrams. He began to explain the concept of gravity assist, a technique used in spaceflight to borrow the gravitational pull of planets, allowing a spacecraft to accelerate or redirect with minimal fuel. Evan listened quietly. He didn't take notes, but his eyes lit up when Caldwell drew the trajectory map. Arcs, turns, zones of acceleration. "This was the path of the Cassini mission as it passed Saturn," Caldwell said, drawing arrows on the orbit. Evan remained silent for a moment. Then he turned to a fresh sheet and drew. He didn't copy the diagram. He drew a tree branch. But if placed side by side with the Cassini route, the resemblance was uncanny. No one had taught him that. A week later, Caldwell came back. This time he asked permission to take Evan somewhere special, a simulation lab in the basement of a nearby university where he had once taught. "You won't need to touch the machines," he said. "But you can watch. And if you feel like it, draw." Louise was hesitant, but eventually she agreed. The morning Evan stepped into that lab was the first time in his life he had seen a real 3D model. Not from books, not from imagination. On the giant screen, a simulation showed the paths between Earth and Mars. A small orb moved slowly along a bent orbit line. A young engineer turned to Caldwell. "This model just updated. Still unstable. Gravitational data's off." Caldwell nodded, then looked at Evan. "Would you like to draw what you think the correct path is?" Evan said nothing. He walked over to the whiteboard, drew a soft curve, then gently branched it into two directions. The lines were fine, fragile even, like a twig on the verge of snapping, yet balanced perfectly between opposing forces. The engineer stared. He entered the new parameters. The software ran the simulation again. Result: error margin dropped by 89%. No one spoke. Only Caldwell smiled. That evening, Evan returned to the steps of his back porch. He didn't say much. His mother didn't ask. But she knew. Something had shifted. He drew a new tree branch. Small, delicate, not wide, and at the end of each branch he left it open. He didn't close the lines, didn't finish the phrase. "Why don't you finish the drawing?" his mother asked. Evan looked toward the forest, thoughtfully. "Because the force isn't done moving yet." "What force?" "The force of understanding each other." That was the first time Louise felt the curves her son had drawn all these years were no longer just a mystery. They were an invitation, not just to observe, but to follow. He didn't stop at the shiny robots. He stopped in front of a lonely drawing pinned to the far wall. The gymnasium buzzed with noise. Projectors hummed, poster boards stood like sentinels of ambition, and 100 different voices competed for attention. Plastic volcanoes erupted in loops. Miniature wind turbines spun under box fans. High schoolers, dressed in borrowed confidence, rehearsed their pitches for passing judges. In the farthest corner, under a flickering fluorescent light, stood Evan's project. It had no moving parts, no sound, no buttons to press, just a wooden board. And on it, a pattern made of twisted copper wires and threads of white yarn. It looked like a tree, if trees grew in the shape of whispers. The branches didn't point up. They branched outward and downward, curling into each other like breath held too long. No titles, no explanations, just one line written in pencil at the bottom. "If force is free, it chooses where to rest." Evan stood beside it in silence. He wasn't dressed to impress. His shirt was creased, his sneakers dusty. While other students smiled brightly and gestured with practiced hands, Evan simply waited. Most people passed by with a glance. Some frowned. One parent whispered, "Is that art or science?" A boy from another booth snorted, "Looks like a tangled phone charger." But Evan didn't blink. He never defended his drawings. Not at home, not at school, not here. He didn't speak the language of exhibitions. He only spoke in curves. And then, someone stopped. The man was older than most. Silver hair, thick glasses, a cane in one hand, and a weathered leather notebook in the other. He didn't walk quickly, but when he moved, the crowd seemed to part around him, like gravity remembered him. He wandered past the robots, past the sound sensors and solar-powered fans. He walked as if searching for something no one else had brought. And when he saw Evan's board, he stopped. Not for a second. Not in polite curiosity. He stopped like a man recognizing his own handwriting in someone else's diary. "Did you make this?" the man asked. Evan nodded. "What is it?" Evan didn't look up. "It's the path of force," he said quietly. The man leaned closer, tracing one of the copper lines with his eyes, never touching it. "These aren't just branches," he murmured. "They're transitions, energy gradients, acceleration shifts." Other students started watching. Teachers whispered. The science fair was designed to celebrate talent, but no one expected reverence. The man turned to Evan again. "Where did you learn to map like this?" Evan finally looked up. "I didn't," he said. "I just follow the bend. The way a thing leans when you don't hold it." The man exhaled slowly, like someone standing on the edge of a memory. "My name is Dr. Everett Caldwell," he said. "I used to teach orbital mechanics, worked with NASA for 30 years. And what you've drawn, right here, is something our lab's been trying to model for over 4 years." The room fell quiet. Evan said nothing. Dr. Caldwell smiled gently. "We've built simulations, algorithms, even trained AI systems to trace low-energy gravitational paths between planets. But the transitions, the subtle curvatures, they've always eluded us. Too delicate, too human." He pointed to a single spiral in Evan's diagram. This is how a spacecraft can use a planet's pull, not to slingshot, but to settle. This is a soft landing in motion. A science teacher tried to intervene. "Sir, I'm not sure." But Caldwell held up a hand, not to silence, but to honor. Then he turned to the crowd and said, loud enough for every judge and student to hear, "This is not an art piece. This is a gravitational routing map. One we haven't been able to recreate in 4 years of simulations." Louise arrived at the gym 15 minutes later. She hadn't planned to come. But a call from the school office told her Evan was being asked for a follow-up interview. Something to do with NASA, they'd said. She hurried through the crowd and found him standing beside a group of professors and judges. Caldwell approached her with a warmth that didn't feel rehearsed. "Ma'am," he said, "your son sees things the rest of us calculate." She blinked. He went on. "We call them invisible forces. Gravity, momentum, trajectory bends. But your boy, he draws them like roots in the air." Louise looked at Evan. He wasn't smiling, but something in his shoulders had changed. Lighter. As if someone had finally said out loud what he always knew. That his silence wasn't emptiness. It was structure. That night, after the applause and the quiet ride home, Evan sat on the porch and drew again. This time on a new canvas. A wooden panel Caldwell had gifted him, polished and blank. He drew slowly. The first line curved gently upward, then split. One path curled inward, tight and compressed. The other arched wide, taking its time. They met again at the bottom, not as opposites, but as twins who had chosen different journeys. Louise brought him tea, placed it beside him. "You okay?" she asked. Evan didn't speak right away. Then he whispered, "Today, someone saw what I drew and followed it." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because for the first time, his lines weren't just sketches in the dark. They were becoming paths someone else could walk. No one said a word, because he had just said the word NASA. When Evan opened the door, the morning sunlight came in quietly, like a guest who didn't want to interrupt. On the table, between a glass of half-finished orange juice and a worn pencil sharpener, was a drawing Evan had left the night before. A new branch, twisting outward in a way his mother had never seen. Louise stood by the stove, trying to keep the eggs from burning, but her eyes kept drifting back to that page. There was something unspoken in the way the lines curved, not just outward, but inward too, like a secret trying to return home. She didn't understand the drawing, but she didn't need to. She had come to understand her son. And now, others were starting to as well. Dr. Caldwell returned that morning, but this time, he didn't come alone. With him was a younger man, late 30s, clean-shaven, sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses. He introduced himself as Dr. Raj Patel, associate professor at a local university and an expert in nonlinear dynamics. Louise made coffee. Evan stood barefoot on the porch. Caldwell placed a worn cardboard tube on the table and gently rolled out a large sheet of drafting paper. "This," he said to Evan, "is the current model NASA uses to plan low-thrust trajectories between Earth and Jupiter." The diagram looked like a river made of light. Multiple paths weaved through gravitational wells, each one curved and folded like silk drifting in zero gravity. Evan stared at it, not with amazement, but with recognition. He reached into his backpack and pulled out one of his older sketches, from 3 years ago, drawn on the back of a cereal box. He unfolded it slowly. There were holes where the cardboard had frayed, but the lines were still there, precise, looping, layered. He placed it beside Caldwell's diagram. And for a moment, time stopped. Patel leaned in. The resemblance was impossible, not approximate, not inspired by. It was nearly exact. But Evan's lines weren't calculated with data. They were drawn by hand, in the quiet of a forgotten town, by a boy who had never taken a physics class. Caldwell pointed to one junction. "This is a Lagrange transfer curve. We only modeled this 6 months ago." Evan nodded. "That's where the force folds," he said. "Folds?" Patel asked. Evan took a piece of string from his pocket, tied it to a pebble, and let it hang. It swung gently in the morning air. Then he brought a magnet close to it, not touching, just enough to bend the motion. "You don't have to push," he said. "You just have to invite." Patel sat down. He wasn't smiling, not because he wasn't impressed, but because his mind was already racing through equations, simulations, and years of work that suddenly felt incomplete. "You see paths," he said quietly. "You feel them." Evan said nothing. He didn't need to. Louise stepped outside with a tray of coffee and paused at the doorway. The two men were leaning over her son's sketch like it was an ancient map. And her son, quiet, barefoot, holding a twig, was showing them the stars. Later that day, they drove to the university. It wasn't a formal visit. No papers signed, no forms filled. But Caldwell wanted to show Evan something. They entered through a side door and descended into the sub-basement, where the simulation lab lived. A long, dim corridor of cold air and humming machines. Inside, graduate students worked in silence, hunched over models of solar systems glowing on screens. Each orbit pulsed with shifting force fields. One student looked up and frowned at Evan's bare feet, but no one said anything. Caldwell walked Evan to a large screen. "This is a live simulation of potential return paths from Mars," he said. "The probe has to slingshot past Earth, Venus, and the Moon, but we're losing efficiency at the second transition." Evan watched as the glowing line on the screen broke, then snapped back into place, like a thread under tension. He tilted his head, blinked once, then reached for the whiteboard nearby. He drew slowly. First a wide arc, then a narrowing curl. The curl didn't end. It branched softly, like a fingertip brushing water. Then it folded back, slightly offset from the starting point, like a spiral that remembered where it had been. Patel watched the drawing. "This is a recursive bend," he whispered, "but it preserves kinetic symmetry." He ran to the console and began entering parameters, translating curves into coordinates. A moment later, the new path appeared on the screen, glowing green. The second transition stabilized. Efficiency improved by 27%. The lab fell silent, not from awe, but from the quiet of minds being rewired. One of the graduate students walked over. She looked skeptical. "What's your background?" she asked Evan. "Are you in a special math program?" Evan looked at her, then at the screen. "No," he said. "I just draw what feels like it won't break." That evening, back at home, Evan sat by the window with a pencil in hand. But he wasn't drawing. Not yet. His mother sat beside him, folding laundry in silence. "Today," Evan said, "they asked me what my methods were." "What did you say?" "I said, I listen." She looked at him. "To what?" He smiled, just a little. "To the part of the world that still moves even when no one's watching." And then he drew again. A branch. Not large, not dramatic, but with a curve in it so gentle, so patient, that if you blinked, you'd miss it. And in that curve lived something no satellite had yet discovered. But one boy, barefoot and listening, already had. They wouldn't let him touch the computers, but they let him draw. The corridor smelled like cold metal and burnt coffee. The tiles echoed every footstep, as if the building wasn't used to visitors walking slowly. Graduate students moved past without looking up, eyes fixed on code, on charts, on results. Evan walked quietly behind Dr. Caldwell. He wasn't sure why his heart was beating faster. The lab was underground, windowless, gray. But to Evan, it felt like the opposite of empty. The air was thick with questions. At the end of the hall was a heavy door labeled Restricted, Research Personnel Only. Caldwell swiped a card. The lock clicked. They entered. Inside, the lab was nothing like Evan had imagined. No blinking lights, no holograms, just wide monitors, blackboards crowded with equations, and quiet. The kind of quiet that hums beneath calculation. In the center of the room stood a cluster of terminals. Screens displayed 3D orbits, spirals twisting between planetary spheres, colored gradients mapping gravitational pull. Caldwell nodded to a younger woman at one of the stations. "That's Dr. Min, one of our best minds. She's been stuck on the Mars-Europa corridor for weeks." Dr. Min glanced at Evan, expression unreadable, then turned back to her monitor. Caldwell pulled up a file. A map of potential gravity assist routes from Earth to Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. Each attempt rendered a tangled mess of lines and dead ends. Fuel constraints, alignment delays, solar wind. Too many variables, he muttered. We've modeled 59 versions. None of them hold. He stepped back. Then, without prompting, handed Evan a piece of chalk. You don't have to solve it, Caldwell said. Just respond. Evan walked to the blackboard. The room didn't stop for him. Typing continued. Someone adjusted the fan, but a few eyes turned, if not curious, then at least cautious. He didn't hesitate. He drew one line, then another, then paused. He looked not at the board, but at the air, as if listening to something only he could hear. The chalk moved again, this time curving slightly, spiraling. The spiral stopped just short of closing. Instead, it released. A branching arc, soft and outward. He stepped back. No one clapped. No one gasped. But Caldwell leaned forward, lips parting slightly. Not in surprise, but in recognition. Dr. Min narrowed her eyes. That looks organic, she said. But gravitational curves don't grow like that. Evan answered softly. Only if you force them. She frowned. You're suggesting the path should adapt? He nodded. Like water on glass. Dr. Min crossed her arms. That's poetic, but computers don't speak poetry. Caldwell didn't argue. He uploaded Evan's drawing into the simulator manually, converting the curves into rough parameters. A few numbers had to be estimated, a few lines tweaked. The simulation ran. Silence. Then the room filled with green. A success path. One that hadn't appeared in any of the previous attempts. Fuel consumption dropped by 22%. Transfer window widened. Error margin fell below threshold. The lab went still. Someone whispered, "No way." Dr. Min stood motionless. She didn't smile. But she didn't look away from the screen either. Then she turned to Evan. Draw another. And he did. Over the next 2 hours, Evan drew 5 paths. 3 worked immediately. 1 was better than anything they'd seen. And 1, the last one, couldn't be processed. It didn't fit their equations. Caldwell saved it anyway. This one, he said, we'll need time to understand. When the day ended, Caldwell walked Evan back to the entrance. You don't have to come again, he said. But if you do, this place has paper and chalk and problems waiting to be drawn. Evan looked up at the ceiling, where pipes ran like roots above their heads. I like this place, he said. Caldwell smiled. I thought you would. That night, Evan didn't draw. He sat by the window and looked out at the pine trees, their dark silhouettes against the stars. His mother brought him tea. Long day? He nodded. Did they listen to you? Evan thought for a moment. They let me listen, he said. Then he added quietly, almost as if to himself, and when I did, they heard something too. Somewhere beneath a university, a chalkboard still held the curve he had left behind. No one knew what to name it, but someone would try. When the simulation failed, the boy stepped forward, drew a single curve, and everything changed. Tuesday morning. It was supposed to be a routine test. The lab was running what they called a probabilistic multi-body simulation, a predictive model meant to optimize space travel between Earth and Saturn's outer moons. Dozens of variables were calibrated, planetary positions aligned. The system had been stress-tested the night before. Everything was ready, but the path kept breaking. Again and again. Dr. Min stood with her arms folded, eyes narrowing at the red route invalid message blinking on the screen. "It shouldn't be failing," she muttered. "It's the fourth model in 2 weeks," said one of the doctoral students. "The instability occurs right after the Titan flyby. Every time." Another added, "Solar interference should be negligible at that angle." Caldwell leaned over the display. "Unless we're underestimating gravitational bleed from Enceladus." A silence followed. In a room of equations and data, this was the sound of friction, when certainty and reality began to separate. Evan sat on the edge of a rolling chair in the corner. He hadn't said anything all morning. He never interrupted. But this time, he stood. He walked slowly to the whiteboard. No one stopped him. No one encouraged him either. He picked up a marker and drew. It wasn't fast, but it was certain. A curve, bending wider than usual, then a spiral. Not tight, gentle, open at one end. Then another branch, not away from the spiral, but into it, like a current turning in on itself before slipping through. He stepped back. "That's impossible," a student mumbled. "That's not a stable route." "It's not meant to be," Evan said quietly. "It's meant to break, once, to find where it holds again." Dr. Min turned to him. "You're suggesting a soft destabilization to gain alignment?" Evan nodded. "Sometimes a path has to fall out of orbit before it hears where it belongs." Caldwell didn't say a word. He uploaded the curve. The simulation engine recalculated the variables. The lab waited. The display flickered. A moment of tension like breath held too long. Then the new path glowed green. Not perfect, but valid. And for the first time, a route passed through Titan's field without breaking. Dr. Min exhaled. Caldwell looked at the team. "Run it again. With noise. Add solar interference." They did. It held. Slight fluctuations, but no disintegration. Caldwell turned to Evan. "You saw the weakness, but instead of avoiding it, you built it into the route." Evan looked down at the marker in his hand. "No path is always strong," he said, "but a good one remembers where it cracked." The story spread across campus by afternoon. Some students whispered about the barefoot boy who walked into the lab and fixed a broken simulation. Others dismissed it as a myth. But those who had been there remembered. Because there was something in the way Evan moved, not with brilliance, but with trust. Trust in the curve, trust in the break, trust in the bend that returns. That evening, Evan stayed behind. The lab had emptied. Caldwell sat with him, sipping tea from a thermos. They didn't talk much. Evan stood in front of the chalkboard. He wasn't drawing a route this time. He was drawing a tree. Each branch curved back toward the trunk. Not perfectly, but enough to show that even distance can carry memory. Caldwell watched. "That's not a path," he said. Evan nodded. "It's what happens after you walk one." Down the hall, the simulation continued to run. The route was holding, and somewhere deep in the servers, beneath layers of data, under millions of calculations, a new parameter had been entered by hand. Evan Branch Model, Iteration 1. Outside, the night was quiet. The moon was a sharp white arc over the trees. And in a room with no windows, a boy had just redrawn what it meant to fall and still find your way forward. The report included a line, inspired by the drawings of an unnamed boy. It never made it past the review board. Dr. Caldwell typed slowly. He wasn't a fast writer, but he chose every word with care. The report, 32 pages long, outlined a series of simulations, failures, and a final breakthrough, a gravitational routing model that passed through Titan's unstable corridor. The document included data logs, timestamps, video frames, even a side-by-side comparison between the flawed routes and the one Evan had drawn. But it was the last page that mattered most. There, in the final paragraph, Caldwell wrote, "This approach was first observed in a hand-drawn structure by a 16-year-old student not enrolled at this institution. His model provided the initial curve from which this solution was derived. His intuition demonstrates a form of spatial reasoning that warrants further study." He debated adding Evan's name. But the university had rules. The lab had policies. He wrote, "Drawings provided by unaffiliated youth observer, name available upon request." He submitted the report at 2:13 a.m. At 2:17 a.m., it was automatically routed to the university's internal review board, and by 9 o'clock a.m., it had been blocked. The message came with no explanation. Submission does not meet internal authorship and verification standards. No comments. No edits requested. Just silence. Caldwell stared at the screen, then forwarded it to Patel. Patel replied 10 minutes later. "They're afraid it undermines the structure. A boy with no credentials fixing a problem we couldn't? That doesn't look good in funding reports." Caldwell didn't reply. Evan wasn't told. Not right away. That afternoon, he was back in the lab, drawing in chalk again. A new curve, this one shaped more like a wave, tapering inward as it rose. Caldwell stood behind him. "You know," he said gently, "not everyone will be ready for your way of seeing things." Evan looked at the board. "I don't draw to be ready," he said. "I draw because I already hear it." Caldwell nodded, but something in his chest tightened. Patel met Caldwell that evening in the parking lot. "You knew this would happen," he said. "Yes." "Then why send the report?" Caldwell looked at the sky. "Because sometimes, even if a door is locked, you still knock, just to hear how many bolts are behind it." Patel didn't smile, but he didn't argue. Instead, he handed Caldwell a USB stick. "What's this?" "A backup, just in case we decide the world should see it anyway." The next day, one of the graduate students, a quiet girl named Mia, approached Evan after lab hours. "I saw your curve," she said. Evan nodded. "I recorded the simulation, when your route held." He said nothing. "I posted it." That made him pause. "Posted?" "Just the side-by-side. No names, just the drawing, the path, and the moment it stabilized." Evan looked at her. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because when I saw it, I believed something for the first time in months, and I thought maybe someone else needed to believe too." The clip was only 47 seconds long. It started with a failed simulation. Red, jittering, collapsing. Then the drawing. Simple. Silent. Then the curve. Glowing green. No commentary. No music. But within 12 hours, it had over 100,000 views. Within 2 days, over 1 million. The comments came like rain. Who made that curve? Why haven't we seen this approach before? Is this even real? This isn't math. This is music in space. Someone called it the whisper route. The name stuck. Louise found out from a friend. "Your son's on the internet," the friend said awkwardly. "They're calling him the boy who draws space." Louise wasn't sure how to feel. She opened the video on her old tablet, watched in silence. At the end, she whispered, "That's my boy." Not in pride, but in recognition. At the university, Caldwell received another email. "Please refrain from referencing unaffiliated contributors in official documents moving forward." He printed it, folded it, and slipped it into his notebook, right next to Evan's first sketch. Then he picked up the phone, called an old friend at an independent science journal. "I have a paper that was blocked," he said. "Is it bad?" "No," Caldwell said. "It's beautiful. Too beautiful for their rules." The editor paused. "Then send it here." That night, Evan didn't draw. He stood barefoot on the porch, feeling the wind against his skin. Louise joined him, holding a blanket. "There are people watching your lines now," she said. Evan nodded. "But are they seeing?" She looked at him. "Maybe not all of them, but some will." He looked at the stars. "I never drew for them," he said. "I know," she replied, "and I won't stop." "I know that too." In a locked drawer somewhere inside a building with glass walls and frosted doors, Evan's name remained redacted. But on a million screens, his curve glowed, silent, soft, unclaimed by any institution. And it held. Even without permission, it held. He didn't draw to help rockets fly. He drew to help force rest. It started with a message from Patagonia. A man, a retired physicist living by the sea, had seen the viral video. He had watched it 12 times. Then he sent an email to Dr. Caldwell. "I don't know who your boy is, but I've been trying to solve that same orbital curve since 1973, and I never thought to listen to the break." Then came another message, from a graduate student in Norway, then one from Brazil, then Kenya. Some were scientists, but most were not. They were painters, pilots, teachers, people who'd never held a physics textbook. But they had watched the curve, and somehow it spoke to them. They didn't see it as an equation. They saw it as a way to live. Meanwhile, in the lab, Caldwell was working with Evan on something bigger. Not just paths between planets, but a new approach to mapping, the soft force routing model. "Most maps," Caldwell said, "are made for those who walk in straight lines, who plan, who measure, who push." Evan nodded. "I don't draw for them," he said. "I draw for those who drift, who bend, who almost don't arrive, but somehow still do." So they gave the project a name. Branch Map. It wasn't a chart. It wasn't a system. It was a conversation between force and motion, between the one who pulls and the one who finally yields. To the scientists, it was a new paradigm. To Evan, it was the first time someone asked him, "How do you think the world moves?" He never answered in words. He only drew. One evening, as the sun set in orange folds behind the university buildings, Dr. Min stopped Evan outside the lab. She was holding one of his older sketches, one she had quietly saved after a long shift. "I don't get it," she said, "but I believe it." He looked at the paper. "That's enough," he said. "Belief doesn't always mean understanding. Sometimes it just means you stayed long enough." She smiled for the first time. The lab began receiving letters, actual letters, handwritten. A girl in a psychiatric hospital wrote, "I saw the curve. It's how my thoughts feel before I take medicine. Wild, but trying to be gentle." A farmer from Iowa wrote, "Your boy's path? That's how rain moves when it finally forgives the ground. A man from Tokyo who had lost his daughter in an accident wrote, "The curve reminded me that not everything has to return to the center to be whole." Evan read none of them. He didn't need to. He was already drawing the next one. This time it was different. The curves weren't from a central point. They started fractured, unbalanced, like limbs once broken but now learning how to grow around pain. Caldwell watched quietly. "This doesn't look like a route." Evan replied, "It's not." "What is it then?" He paused. "A map for those who never walk straight, but still get there." One day, Patel pulled Caldwell aside. "There's talk at the top," he said. "They want to know what we're doing, where it's going." Caldwell shrugged. "They can ask." "They're not asking. They're preparing. They think we're trying to dismantle the system." Caldwell looked tired, but not afraid. "Maybe we are," he said. "Not out of anger, but because it's broken. And this boy is showing us another way." That night, Evan sat alone in the empty lab. No noise, no keys clicking, just silence. He stood in front of the board and erased the last drawing. Then, with his eyes closed, he drew one line. It swayed. It wobbled. It circled back. It hesitated. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fast, but it arrived. And beneath it, for the first time, he wrote words. "Not all who bend are lost." Across the world, people were printing his curve, pinning it above desks, tattooing it on arms, hanging it in classrooms, and always, always, they traced it with their fingers, slowly, gently, because something in its shape felt like forgiveness. The university never approved the project, but they couldn't stop it. Because Branch Map had already left the lab, it lived in notebooks without degrees, in children's sketchbooks, in hospital walls, in places where the straight path had long vanished, and in those places the curve held. His talk was deleted from the official stream, but one student had recorded everything. It was a cloudless morning when Caldwell adjusted his tie for the first time in over a year. The lecture was part of a prestigious conference on advanced trajectory design, a gathering of minds in tailored suits, with lanyards too clean, and voices that rarely trembled. They had offered him 10 minutes. 10 minutes to present a breakthrough that had rewritten their models. 10 minutes to speak about a boy who never studied their math, but saw through it anyway. 10 minutes to bring Branch Map out of the quiet and into the light. Caldwell stood backstage, holding a flash drive. Inside it, simulations, timestamps, Evan's sketches, side-by-side comparisons with standard gravitational models, and the soft curve routes that Evan had drawn with only chalk and instinct. He took a breath and walked into the light. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today I'd like to show you something not just new, but different. Something that doesn't improve our equations. It reimagines why we write them in the first place." A few frowns already. He clicked. On the screen behind him, Evan's drawing appeared. Not perfect, not clean, but real, alive. Some of you will say this is art, and you'd be right. But it's also how a spacecraft returned from lunar orbit using 23% less fuel than our best estimate. Murmurs. One hand raised. "Dr. Caldwell, are you implying this was discovered by someone outside of formal aerospace education?" "I'm not implying," Caldwell said calmly. "I'm stating it." He paused, then added, "His name is Evan. He's 16, and he listens to motion the way most of us only listen to results." Silence. He clicked again. The simulation ran. Red, traditional route. Green, Evans curve. The green moved slower, softer, and landed smoother. Someone stood up in the back. "We're here to discuss validated models, not anecdotal intuition." And Caldwell replied simply, "Then I'm in the wrong room." After the lecture, his talk was removed from the conference website. Audio corrupted, the site claimed. Slides unrecoverable. Emails were not returned. Files disappeared from the public schedule. But one student, a second-year undergrad named Rowan, had been sitting in the fourth row. He had recorded the whole thing on his phone. He didn't mean to. He just felt like it mattered. He uploaded it to his personal channel, titled simply, "This Man Just Changed How We Think About Space." No tags, no fancy thumbnail. But in the first 24 hours, the video hit 300,000 views. In 2 weeks, 7.8 million. And people began asking not, "What is this?" but, "Who drew this?" Louise saw it one evening as she walked past the local diner. On the TV above the counter, muted and cracked at the edges, was Evan's sketch. The one with the spiral that folded in on itself before releasing. Underneath, the caption, "The Boy Who Bends Gravity." She stopped. The waitress recognized her. "That's your son, isn't it?" Louise nodded. And for once, the whole diner went quiet. At the university, Caldwell sat with Evan outside the lab. "They deleted your name," he said, "but the world didn't." Evan didn't look surprised. He just traced a curve in the dirt with his finger. "I don't need a name on their screen," he said. Caldwell waited. "What do you need?" he asked. Evan looked up. "Somewhere to draw where it won't be erased." The student who posted the clip received hundreds of messages. A teacher in Canada said she used it to explain gravity to third graders. A retired engineer said he cried watching it. A boy in India sent a drawing, his own curve, with a note, "I never thought I was allowed to think like this." Caldwell was invited to speak on a podcast. He declined, but he sent a message. "This isn't a story about me. It's not even about one boy. It's about every mind we told was wrong, when they were just walking a different curve." One night, Evan drew in silence. No lights, just moon. He wasn't copying a simulation. He wasn't fixing a path. He was remembering the time he first traced a branch into the soil behind the house, the way no one watched, the way no one needed to. He folded the paper, and on the back he wrote, "If I ever disappear, follow the line that hesitates. That's where I left a door open." The next morning, the dean of the university issued a statement. "We value all contributions that meet scientific rigor and institutional standards." But by then, it was too late, because the world had already seen not just the path, but the boy who bent it. His name never appeared on the flight documents, but it was written quietly inside every route they followed. The launch was quiet. Not in spectacle. The cameras rolled, the engines roared, but in meaning. No one mentioned Evan. No speeches were made about soft routing or chalk curves. But those who knew, they watched more closely. Because on the screen showing the trajectory model, someone had labeled the final curve before the slingshot burn with 2 simple words: branch path. It was a minor mission, a mid-orbit probe meant to collect data between Mars and Europa. But it used a route that didn't exist on any textbook, a route that flexed, not resisted, when pulled. The team called it elegant. One engineer off the record said, "It feels alive, like the probe isn't fighting gravity, it's listening to it." At home, Evan didn't watch the launch. He was in the woods behind his house, sitting beneath a pine tree with a blank notebook in his lap. A robin sang above him, off-key and persistent. He smiled. Louise walked out with a thermos. "You're missing your rocket," she teased. He shook his head. "I'm not missing anything. It's already flying." She sat beside him. "What's next?" He thought for a long time, then replied, "Something that doesn't fly. Something that stays." A week later, a small envelope arrived at the house. No return address. Inside, a photograph. The probe, mid-space, with stars behind it. On the back, someone had written, "Trajectory, branch path, holding steady. P.S. You changed how we travel." Louise framed it, hung it above the kitchen table. Below it, Evan taped a napkin where he'd drawn his first spiral at age 5, the one he thought was just a seashell. Turns out, it was gravity listening. Around the world, the curve lived on. A school in Seoul used it to teach flow mapping. A hospital in Lisbon printed it on ceilings of recovery rooms. A prison library in Detroit had it sketched onto the wall, labeled, "The way back isn't straight, and that's okay." At an orphanage in Morocco, children used chalk to draw their own versions of it across the courtyard, laughing as they made up names. The dancing tree, the wiggly rocket, the hug line. None of them knew Evan, but they knew what he gave them: a shape that forgave the stumble. At the university, Dr. Caldwell quietly retired. He left behind a sealed box labeled Branch Archive. Inside were every sketch Evan ever gave him. Some were on napkins, others on receipts, one drawn with charcoal on the back of a pizza box. He included a note. These were once called impossible. Now they are called instructions. And Evan? He kept drawing, but more slowly now. He no longer tried to fix broken simulations. He began drawing places instead. Not with names, but with curves. A field that invites stillness. A path that leads back after an argument. A room where the silence holds you like a friend. Each one had its own shape. Each one waited to be walked. One autumn morning, he mailed a package to a science museum. No return address. Inside, a folded map. No countries, no borders. Just a branching path that began from a circle and wandered, meandering, returning, splitting, merging again. At the bottom, one line. To those who never walked straight, you were never lost, just curved. Years later, a new branch of spaceflight adopted the branch path as its standard. They removed the name, but never touched the shape. Because some things can be redacted from paper, but not from motion. In the end, Evan's name didn't appear in textbooks, not because he failed, but because the world still hasn't figured out how to define someone who listens to space the way others listen to sound. He didn't need monuments. He had maps, and they were still being followed, one curve at a time. Somewhere, between two stars, a spacecraft bends, not to resist gravity, but to trust it. And in that soft bend, he is still drawing. I have met many kinds of people in my life. The ones who move with confidence. The ones who knew at 18 who they would become. The ones who map their lives in titles, credentials, and the shortest line from point A to point B. And then there are others. People like Evan. They don't walk. They drift. They watch quietly. They hear things others don't. They move at a frequency too soft for applause, but strong enough to shift how the world turns. They don't speak loudly. But every time they draw a line, the map changes. Maybe you've drawn a curve in a notebook once, then torn the page because it didn't fit. Maybe you've sat in a meeting, a classroom, or in your own life, feeling like you didn't belong simply because your way of seeing didn't look like everyone else's. If so, this story was for you. Evan didn't need test scores. He didn't need a podium. He just needed a quiet piece of ground, a dry twig, and a space soft enough for gravity to whisper. He didn't win. He reached. And sometimes reaching is enough. So, if there's one truth I hope you carry from these branches and bends, it's this. Not every path must be straight to be right, and not everyone who veers is lost. Sometimes, they're just drawing the map for the rest of us. The author, and to you, the reader, if you've made it here, to this very last word, thank you. Thank you for listening gently, for walking the curve, for trusting a quiet boy's line across the stars. In a world that moves fast, your time is a gift. And I hope, somehow, this story gave something back. Wherever you are, keep walking your way, even if it bends. It just might be the way forward for someone else.